Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 34. Why does the term daughter get used so much in this chapter?
Daughter is a really significant word in this passage. In fact, it's used more than 14 times. This is, of course, well after the fact that we've already been introduced to Dinah. She's continued to refer to as alternatively the daughter of Leah at first, and then the daughter of Jacob, and then his daughter, and then even actually she's referred to as the daughter of the sons of Jacob, even though she's their sister. So Hamor refers to her as your daughter when he's speaking in the plural to Jacob's son. So that's kind of an interesting thing in and of itself. But that is then added to the uses of daughters to refer more generally to, we will give you our daughters to marry, and we will marry your daughters, which is the arrangement that Shechem and his father are trying to arrange with Jacob and his sons. And this repeated usage of daughter, I think, does a couple of things in the narrative. Number one, it intensifies the emotional appeal of the situation that Dinah and then also Dinah's brothers find themselves in. Of this daughter of Jacob has been attacked and assaulted by this man Shechem, and her vulnerability and also the natural anger that any brother or father would feel is accentuated for the reader by constantly being reminded of the fact that this is the daughter of Jacob. So I think her familial relationship is being underscored for that reason. But beyond just the references to Dinah, the use of daughter throughout the passage as sort of this central word is, I think, increasing our understanding of the stakes that are involved beyond just the immediate context of Dinah's predicament and the brothers' response, but the offer that the Canaanites are making of this arrangement of becoming one people, essentially, with the family of Jacob. And that presents this almost perilous predicament for Jacob's family before they're even at this status of growing into a nation. Is the project of growing into the nation of Israel going to come undone by this family settling in this town of Shechem, intermarrying with the Hivites and becoming one people with the Hivites, and eventually, essentially, becoming Hivites? And so that theme of daughter really underscores the drama of the danger of the promises never realizing their fulfillment if Jacob and his family settle in among the people of Shechem and become one people with them.
What additional bigger themes for the book of Genesis are developed in this passage?
Well, there's a couple of interesting ones, but one that I'd like to just touch on briefly is the interesting introduction that we're really given to Levi in this passage. So Levi is one of Jacob's sons. He's one of the children of Leah. And Levi, along with his brother Simeon, are the ones who are the two who are called out as the men who take up swords and they go kill all the men of Shechem. The other brothers were just told they come along later and they plunder in the aftermath of the violence that's been done. But it's interesting that Levi and Simeon are called out in particular. And thinking of Levi most particularly, when we get to the end of the Genesis narrative, or toward the end, when there's the blessings that are spoken over Jacob's sons, Jacob has some interesting things to say about Simeon and Levi and their propensity to violence, but then also how that will play forward in their future when they, through their descendants, become tribes. And then we think more holistically about who the Levites become and what their role is in Israel. They'll, of course, become the clan, the tribe of priests. And particularly throughout kind of the time of the Exodus, we'll see some instances where there are the times when there is apostasy or rebellion that is happening in the camp of Israel, and the Levites are the ones who are called to take up the sword and to enact violence and judgment, and even at times kill their own kinsmen from the other tribes in order to preserve the holiness of the people of God. Later, the Levites are going to be tasked with protecting the sacredness of the temple and then and the tabernacle and preserving the holiness of God. And so we kind of put those pieces together. It's interesting that at the end of chapter 34 here in Genesis, Levi and Simeon, when they're rebuked by Jacob, throw it back on Jacob and say, were you just going to allow our sister to be treated like a prostitute? And the implication is, were you not going to do anything about the fact that our family name and our sister's honor had been so directly assaulted? And then later, the Levites are going to become the ones who are charged with preserving the honor of the people of God and the holiness of God's tabernacle. So that is not to justify what Levi does in this situation. It's clearly a wicked, wrong act of vengeance. But it does hint at a trajectory for the tribe of Levi that is going to be concerned about preserving the honor of God's people and the name of God among the people of God.
If Simeon and Levi kill the men of Shechem because they are also children of Leah, like Dinah, then why doesn't Reuben participate too?
Yeah, that's fascinating, right? Because Reuben not only is also one of Leah's sons, but he happens to be the oldest, not only of Leah's sons, but because Leah is, in essence, Jacob's first wife and the first of his wives that produces children for him. Reuben is also Jacob's firstborn in general. He's the oldest of all of these sons. So Reuben's absence, especially by name in this whole incident, is conspicuous. I think a few things this does for us that is going to be further cemented the more we work through the book of Genesis. We're going to see that the right of the kingly line in Israel's future is not going to pass through Reuben. And then it's not going to pass through the next brothers in line. It's not going to go through Simeon. It's not going to go through Levi. It's going to eventually settle on Judah. And the question is, why isn't it on the firstborn or on the secondborn or on the thirdborn? And the answer is these brothers are progressively disqualifying themselves, so to speak, through their godless activity from being the ones who will rightly bear the kingly succession. And I think we're going to see that trajectory increasingly with Reuben the more we work our way through Genesis. But there's a hint of it here. Simeon and Levi sort of jump over Reuben in enacting this revenge or this act of vengeance on behalf of their sister's honor. It's as though Reuben, like his dad, is quiet and passive in this story. So we've noted that Jacob is silent for most of the narrative. He only speaks to rebuke his sons. And when he rebukes his sons, he reveals that his passivity in the face of his daughter's assault is due to his fear of the people of the land. Well, Reuben says nothing this whole time either. And it takes Simeon and Levi stepping forward to actually do something about Dinah. Now, they do the wrong thing, but somebody's doing something, and it's not Reuben. What is Reuben doing? And even though what Simeon and Levi do is the wrong thing, and that seems to be indicated by the fact that the other brothers don't join in, Reuben isn't strong enough as the older brother. He doesn't have enough cachet with them to prevent them from doing this heinous thing. So he, like Jacob, is being shown to be kind of a weak, feckless leader. We roll that forward in Genesis, we're going to find Reuben trying to step up to be the leader for his brothers and the leader of this household, but he's going to do it in a perverse, ungodly way by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, trying to assert dominance through his sexual escapades, and that's going to backfire on Reuben's head dramatically. And then when Joseph comes along, or Jacob's son Joseph is attacked by his brothers, we'll see Reuben trying to step in and save Joseph's life, but once again, we'll see that that Reuben's brothers don't respect him and don't really follow Reuben's leadership. So Reuben, I think, is being set up as the one we expect to be the leader of the tribes of Jacob, but he is progressively demonstrating himself to not be the leader that Israel will need. And so we're going to have to look to someone else, and Judah is going to be the one who emerges.
How should we address Jacob's silence in this passage, especially in light of his spiritual transformation in the last few chapters? Is his silence a faithful waiting on God?
Some commentators would suggest that Jacob's inactivity throughout this passage is actually an act of faith, that he is kind of sitting in the background waiting for God to do something and to intervene. But I think the end of the passage where Jacob rebukes his sons gives us sufficient commentary into what is going on in Jacob's life to dismiss the notion that he's just acting in faith. Jacob's response to his sons is that their act of aggression against the people of Shechem has now placed Jacob and his family in a vulnerable position amongst the Canaanites. And so it would seem that very prominent in Jacob's mind is the tension that he feels of living in this land as a stranger and a sojourner, and recognizing that that places his whole family in a perpetually vulnerable situation of needing to be in good relations with the neighboring peoples. And so his major concern seems to be not rocking the boat with the Canaanites. And so when we then read that attitude back onto the rest of this chapter, I think it maps very well onto Jacob's passivity and quietness, that he is afraid not only of the other Canaanite people, but he's afraid of messing with his relationship with Hamor, who is the kind of king of this land, and Hamor's son Shechem, who's the man who's violated his daughter. If we go back to the previous chapter, it's this same Hamor, the father of Shechem, who Jacob is purchasing the land from, on who he is that he's now living on. So in some ways, Hamor is sort of his patron in the land. He needs Hamor. He is dependent on Hamor. And so the fact that his sons then just go and act this act of violence, one, it deprives Jacob of his immediate kind of protector in the land, and then in a more long-standing way, threatens his ongoing relationships with the Canaanite people in general. So rather than it being an act of faith, I think what we have in Jacob is an act of fear that permeates throughout this passage.
If Jacob is behaving sinfully here, does that mean he wasn't really a changed man?
It is hard. You get this sense of almost whiplash in Jacob's life over these last few chapters. We've been accustomed in the early going in Jacob's life to see him as a man who really is self-assured, who is a man of action and initiative, but a man who doesn't have a whole lot of time for God and is behaving in fairly godless ways. And then he has this encounter with God at Bethel, but then still he sort of sets this condition upon God of, you do these things for me, and then in the future I may place my faith in you. And then he goes and spends 20 years with Laban, and for most of those 20 years behaves fairly godlessly once again. It's only once he's preparing to leave Laban and God directs him to leave Laban that we see these moments of Jacob beginning to shift his perspective, and then that finally is consummated in this nighttime wrestling match with the angel of God, where Jacob finally submits himself to God, asks for a blessing, receives a new name, which I think is indicative of this new spiritual heart that Jacob has, and then he has this beautiful moment of reunion with Esau. But then quick on the heels of that, once again, we come to Shechem, and it feels as though Jacob is settling into some of these old patterns of he's living in fear of man, and he's not calling out to God, and he doesn't seem to be in the place where he's supposed to be. He's not on his way back to his father's house. He's not journeying back through Bethel. And so we don't need to read this and think, okay, this completely negates every spiritual moment of progress that we've seen in Jacob's life, and even seemingly his conversion experience, we might say, or his redemption experience wrestling with the angel of the Lord. We don't need to say that all of those things are negated by this moment of spiritual regress for Jacob. Instead, we can look at Jacob and we can see in him a pattern that we should very much recognize in our own lives, where we too experience moments of great faith and great proximity and closeness and relational fellowship with God, only then to turn around and to fall into old patterns of sin once again, and to need to come again in repentance and faith to God and confess our sin, only to discover that God is once again faithful and just to forgive us, just as God at the beginning of the next chapter is going to call Jacob faithfully, come to Bethel. So it's not as though God is done with Jacob. It is not as though Jacob has never placed his faith or his trust in God. Instead, we see in Jacob the character of human sinfulness is as indicative of the life of the patriarchs as it is present and active in our own life. And so we should be encouraged that even as these great men of faith had these mountaintop moments of faithfulness, then followed by these valley-top moments of faithlessness, that our lives are not so dissimilar to the great men and women of the faith, that we too should look to their example, both in the good and the bad, and see that we should pursue lives of obedience and faith, and also repentance and confession when we fall into sin.
Do we have any idea how old Jacob's sons are in this passage?
They seem to be increasingly moving into a time of adulthood, and this is marked out, I think, in part because of what we can glean from where Dinah is. So Dinah is apparently of an age to where not only is she vulnerable to potential sexual assault, and marry, and the threat of intermarriage, because that's immediately what Shechem requests. But she, at the beginning of the passage, goes out to meet with the women of the land. Well, that indicates for us that she is at least of the age of which the society of the other women is something that would be acceptable to the women of the land, that she wasn't coming in at a time where she was so young that wouldn't make any sense. Well, that helps us understand that the age of these brothers then must be that they were themselves of certainly marriageable age and probably older at this point, because she was younger than some of these older brothers. So she slots kind of in the middle of some of these brothers. Additionally, as we'll move on here within just a couple of chapters, and within a pretty close time period of chapter 34 here, when Joseph is sent on to find out where his brothers are pasturing the sheep, Joseph is 17 years old. So Joseph, one of the younger brothers, is already entering kind of young adulthood at this point. So these older brothers, Simeon and Levi, they're probably men in their even mid-20s, early 30s, somewhere in that range is very possible for the age of these boys. These young men.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.